Hey there, it's Farmer Bill again. I hope you've enjoyed some of my shtick, but it's all been leading up to this. I may take on the persona of Farmer Bill again because I do like comedy, but I want to be really straight with you. One reason why I've done those things is to grab your attention so you might hear this. Every one of us is a combination of everything we've ever learned, of all the different people that have influenced us. And particularly when we were growing up in our homes, in our communities, certain influences have come upon us to define who we are. And sometimes things are shared with us by people that kind of determine where we're going to be heading the rest of our lives. Upon reflection, there were several people that were very instrumental in helping me get where I am today and thinking about race relations. I've been wearing my granddaddy's hat. I love my granddaddy, but everybody recognized that he was a racist. I'm not proud of it. In fact, I want to disavow it. I remember specifically being in the school community in Craven County, which was one of the last counties to be fully integrated back in the early 70s. And I think that my granddaddy fought it tooth and nail. We sat down in his living room, we being my cousins and aunts and uncles, as we always did on Sunday evening, the day before we were to go to the school where we would find, while I was in the 8th grade, we would find the first African Americans in our school classroom. And my granddaddy said, well, you got to go to school with them, but you don't have to associate with them. To me, that didn't make a whole lot of sense because we had been associated with people of color all of our lives. Now, my daddy and mama were not farmers, but my granddaddy and grandmama were. And we helped a lot at their house, whether it be feeding the hogs or gathering eggs from the chickens, and certainly working in the back of every summer. And I spent a lot of time in the kitchen with my grandmama. I loved my grandmama. I loved to eat the fresh dough that she made when making biscuits. I loved to watch her work in the kitchen so hard. She would the idea of multitasking must have started with her. She'd have flour and lard and what everything just flying around, and before it was all said and done, she had cakes and pies and biscuits along with everything else that she had been cooking in the oven and on the stove. And she would sit down in the chair at lunch or dinner, what she called dinner and supper, and be fully exhausted. At her table, remember this plate from one of my sticks? This came from her kitchen. This is what we ate on. But not everybody ate at that table. Some of the very people that we worked with, sometimes even while preparing the meals, were not allowed at that table. There were three really influential people of color: Chris and her husband Leslie, and little sis, who was Leslie's adult sister and never married. In their own way, they influenced me and my brothers in a tremendous way. Occasionally, Dad, who worked in a public job, as he called it, at the oil mill, and Mama would find sometimes part-time employment at a sewing factory. So when they were not available for childcare, they would get Chris to come in, sit with us, clean the house, cook meals. Little did my parents know that Chris also talked to us a lot about the way life was. You see, her husband Leslie was a sharecropper for my granddaddy. Sharecroppers were everywhere in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that I know of, probably since the Civil War. I think it was really a leftover from slavery. It's very difficult for a sharecropper to really get ahead. I'm not really sure what kind of rules my granddaddy had. He had a little book that he put into his shirt pocket, and he would write down what people owed him. It wasn't just Leslie and Chris and little sis, but anybody that came by looking for money for something like a meal or to help bury the dead. And Chris would tell us how difficult it was. It was quite obvious. I was in her house several times, and they didn't have much. When Mom and Daddy got a new dining room table, Daddy said, "I want to give it to Chris and little sis." We went up there, and to think that people that had been in our house so many times didn't even have a dining room set got my attention as an 8-year-old. But Chris and little sis in particular were always around, and at the table would sit us down many times and tell us how it was. Turns out I didn't know this till sometimes later. Little sis, even though she was kind of short and didn't say a whole lot, she had a little snuff that she kept in her mouth. That little wooden pick. Remember one of my sticks I talked about eating wood? I got that from little sis, nibbling on that little snuff stick. And she was a real dynamo in her church. She was outspoken. She would have been what we call a lay leader now, but you would never have known it out at the barn when she was tying tobacco, or in the fields when she was reaching up to top the blossoms out of the tobacco, or when she was raking her yard with a broom. Always constantly working, always constantly striving to do well. But Chris and little sis both told us essentially how they had been and felt mistreated by some of the people that I love most. It opened my eyes. Now, they were mistreated not only just by my grandparents, but they said, but many other places and things that they shared with us. They said it was very difficult at the end of the year to settle up with Granddaddy. I know this in a way. My dad tried to farm with my granddaddy for a couple of years, and he quit, went looking for a public job. He said that he couldn't make any money with Granddaddy. And somehow or another, Leslie, I believe, was taken advantage of. And even though they had enough to eat because they had their own garden and they raised pigs and chickens and so forth, they just simply couldn't get ahead. It was just the way it was, they said. They didn't like it, and I learned not to like it. I could see the inequities in that. When I was in college, my great-granddaddy died. Leslie and Chris and little sis lived right up the path from where my great-grandmama and great-granddaddy lived. Great-granddaddy was a farmer too, and they worked really hard with great-granddaddy over the years. We showed up at the church, my family and I did, early for great-granddaddy's funeral. And Chris and Leslie and little sis were there, dressed in their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes. And this was early. Well before the service was to start, my family was always early for church. And Chris and little sis and Leslie had just come out of the church. And I asked, are they going to stay for worship? And this was the early 70s. My dad said, well, it's customary for colored people to go in and look at the body, give reverence to the body before the worship service, because they feel like they would not be welcomed during the funeral itself. And so they played the game. They honored my family. And to some degree, we all kind of played that game. It was an uncomfortable game. I remember at high school when they finally had full integration. Word got around that whites were supposed to boycott school because a black girl had been elected as the homecoming queen. And we were to protest that. My mom and daddy said, you're going to school. And so too did maybe 4 or 5 other sets of parents. But for the most part, on that day, there was a boycott, believe it or not, by white people. And that night at the football game, when the homecoming queen took the field, on the sidelines, there was a white queen as well. I knew things were not right. But a lot had been told me about the way things were by Chris and little sis. You see, many times, because they couldn't eat at the table at Grandmama's house, Grandmama would put food on plates and hand it to them right outside the door. It just so happened that it was right outside that same door, a door which everybody came in when they came into Grandmama's house. There's also a place where she threw her scraps right out the door. And the chickens were running around eating the scraps, and if it was wet, all that stuff would just get messy. Well, it was there that she would see fit to give a plate of lunch to Leslie and Chris and little sis, and of course they would say thank you and all of that. As time went on, and I went off to school, Carolina and Duke, it became obvious to me that I was a racist, that I had had privileges, and that without change in my own behavior, I could not be the person that Jesus wanted me to be. And of course, as United Methodist pastor, I've been appointed to mostly, predominantly white churches. In fact, they've all been predominantly white. But we've had occasional African Americans come and worship proportionately in Wilmington. I think we did very well. We were open to everybody. Everybody knew it. And probably the first African American Pastor Parish Relations Committee chairperson in a predominantly white church was a part of the people that we could trust and entrust that very important committee. I'm still learning. But I want to thank Chris and Little Sis. There have been so many times that I wanted to tell them thank you. What was really interesting was that I was able to tell Little Sis thank you one day. After Grandmama died, Granddaddy quickly married someone else. She lived a couple of years and she died. Granddaddy married someone else and that marriage didn't work out, and that very nice woman had to leave, which left my granddaddy alone. He had had a stroke and he needed someone to cook for him, just kind of be around. Guess who my extended family reached out to? None other than Little Sis. And one of my last images of Little Sis was how she had cooked breakfast for my granddaddy. And was sitting at the little table that Grandmama and Granddaddy had in the kitchen, which was their little breakfast table. She was sitting at the table with my granddaddy. Times had changed. And I will say that my granddaddy's heart melted a lot. But Little Sis and Chris, I think, were part of that. It really pays to listen. It pays to sit down at the table with people that are not like us. And because of those experiences, I've had no hesitation walking in the streets with an African American pastor and his congregation all through Ahoskie. Every time there was something that came up, Reverend Stackhouse was saying, okay, it's time for us to take to the streets. And we did. And I remember Reverend Watson down in Wilmington and the wonderful worship services and times of fellowship that we had. some of the local restaurants, just together to listen to one another. And I remember some of my members not too long ago being chastised for being who they were, of being a little expressive in worship. We've got a long ways to go. But by the grace of God, hopefully God will allow us to one day sit at a table with Him. As we listen to people like Chris and Little Sis, as we read our Bibles, as we meditate, as we watch people walk through the streets, as we walk and listen, may God grant us the wisdom to do what is right. And may God help us to love one another as He has first loved us. Y'all take care. And you might see Farmer Bill. God bless.